Riffs are too repetitive, the lyrics make no sense. All the songs are B-sides and the cover art's a mess. There's so much here to tear apart. Listen to it for a week, now that week has passed. It's Why I Hate This Album podcast with Tim and Garrett.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Why I Hate This Album. I am one of your hosts, Garrett Harvey. Not with me as usual, co-host extraordinaire, Timothy Richardson. Tim's taken off this week, not entirely sure where he went. Last I saw, he was in California, but I'm pretty sure he found the AirTag I keep in his JanSport somewhere around Santa Barbara, and I lost track of him. I'm sure I'll be back in a few days, but rather than leave you guys high and dry without an episode, I thought I'd put together another chapter in our famous band breakups and bitter feuds, this week focusing on Fleetwood Mac. Now, full disclosure, usually this is a very brief history of the band focusing in on where it all went wrong. What are the issues, the feuds, that sort of deal. And going into this, I didn't know a whole lot about Fleetwood Mac, so a lot of this was news to me, and in fact some of it was shocking news to me. But what ended up happening is I ended up doing a lot more of a history of Fleetwood Mac than I expected to, so this one might be a touch longer, a little bit more detail about the stuff that's slightly less focused on them breaking up, and a little bit more focused on them actually becoming a band, because the origin story of this band is much more complicated and strange than I ever knew, and I highly suspect most of you have never heard this story either. Tim will probably be back next week. We'll probably be doing some sort of awful, what are we on? Oh geez, yeah, we're on a full album. Not going to announce it here. You're going to have to wait an extra week to hear it. Maybe I'll announce it at the end, see who's paying attention. I'll give you a hint. It is not Christian ska. That turned out to be something for another week. As always, rate, review, subscribe, reach out, hatePodMail@gmail.com, at hatePod on Instagram and Threads, album hatePod on Twitter. I'm G Harvey Tweets. Reach out, we'll have a chat. Let me know what you think of these solo casts. They're always a fun time. And if you can, let other folks know to give it a listen too. We always appreciate you sharing it. All right, business out of the way. Let's get to the topic at hand. I give you band breakups and bitter feuds. I don't know what number. I've done a shit ton of these at this point. The story of Fleetwood Mac.
Well, I've been afraid of changing, 'cause
Fleetwood Mac were formed in July of 1967 in London, England by Peter Green, after he left the British blues band John Mayall and the Blues Breakers. Green was on guitar, Mick Fleetwood was on drums, and they managed to lure John McVie to play bass for the band by naming it literally Fleetwood Mac, partly after him, the Mac part. Although that didn't immediately work. Even after naming the band after him, it took some cajoling. Add Jeremy Spencer on slide guitar, and Fleetwood Mac was born. Their self-titled debut album was released in February of 1968, and it sounded nothing like what any of us are picturing when I say the words Fleetwood Mac. Think of it much more like a 1968 Rolling Stones release. Mostly covers, all of it blues, and none of it what I would call the signature Fleetwood Mac sound. The album was fairly successful in the UK, but didn't have much of an international appeal. The band's second solo album, Mr. Wonderful, was released in August of 1968. It was basically just more of the same blues with a few less covers, and was nowhere near as successful as the first one. What seemed like a promising band with that first release suddenly was sent into despair when they realized nobody really cared. Shortly after the release of Mr. Wonderful, 18-year-old guitarist Danny Kirwan joined the band, making Fleetwood Mac a 5-piece band with 3 separate guitarists. Not my cup of tea, but why not? In November 1968, with Kirwan in the band, they released their first #1 single in Europe called Albatross. It was an instrumental with lead guitar by both Green and Kirwan. They followed it up in 1969 with their third album, Then Play On, a much less bluesy, more mellow sound that was ultimately not very well received, and the band was starting to have some personal issues. Fleetwood began drinking fairly heavily, and Green was more than dabbling with acid. In 1969, during a European tour towards the end of that year, Green experienced a bad acid trip at a hippie commune in Munich, and was literally never the same after that. In fact, Green's last studio recording with the band Fleetwood Mac was a song called The Green Monalishi, and its B-side, World in Harmony. The tracks were recorded in Hollywood on the band's third US tour in April of 1970. You'll notice we're already several years into this band, and most of you, with the exception of maybe Mick Fleetwood, probably have never heard of these people. There's a reason for that. Later that month, Green left the band entirely, citing mental health issues caused by bad drugs. In September 1970, Fleetwood Mac released their fourth album, Kiln House. The album took the band in a more melodic rock sound led by by Danny Kirwan's direction. The album was generally well received, but the band was by no means on the rise or even a marginal success. That didn't stop them from touring, though, and while on tour in 1971, guitarist Jeremy Spencer said he was going to go out to get a magazine and just didn't come back. Since it was the 70s, they assumed he was dead and they began searching the local hospitals and morgues. It turned out to be something much worse. Spencer had joined a religious group, aka definitely a cult, known as the Children of God, and he was out of the band. Folks, if you're interested, go take a deep dive on the Children of God. It's just as troubling as it sounds. Bob Welch was brought in to replace Spencer and the band continued. Also around this time, Christine McVie, John's wife, joined the band after having contributed to several songs on the previous album. In September of 1971, the band released their 5th studio album, Future Games. All the new members continued to transform the band's sound into a more melodic rock sound, a little more akin to what we'd all expect when somebody says, "Hey, you want to hear some Fleetwood Mac?" In 1972, just 6 months after the last album, the band released their next album, Bare Trees. The album peaked at number 60, but suddenly the tours were becoming an issue. As the band started to see more success, they also started to party. Everyone in the band was having a good time, but Kirwan had become a completely unreliable drunk. The breaking point came one night when Kirwan smashed his guitar and refused to go on stage while out on tour. The band went on stage without him, performed the entire show, and when it was over, they all voted, and Danny Kirwan was fired from Fleetwood Mac. Guitarist Bob Weston was brought on to replace Kirwan, but that would prove to be an equally disastrous result. You see, in 1973, Mick Fleetwood discovered his wife, Jenny Boyd, was having an affair with new guitarist Bob Weston. Mick, of course, kicked Weston out of the band, leaving just Buckingham and the McVies as the only remaining members of Fleetwood Mac. If this band didn't stumble onto two insanely talented musicians looking to join a totally dysfunctional band, Fleetwood Mac would be doomed. To make matters worse, in late 1973, after the collapse of the US tour, when first Kirwan left and then they had to fire Weston, the band's manager, Clifford Davis, was left with a major touring commitment to fulfill and no band to do it. Davis, concerned that failing to complete the tour would completely destroy his reputation with bookers and promoters, had an idea. He sent a letter to the band in which he said he hadn't, quote, slaved for years to be brought down by the whims of irresponsible musicians, end quote. Davis also claimed that he owned the name Fleetwood Mac and had the right to choose who was a member of the band. So that's what he did. He recruited members of the band Legs to tour in the US in early 1974 under the name The New Fleetwood Mac. The New Fleetwood Mac tour began on January 16, 1974 at the Syria Mosque in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and honestly, it was a huge success. But when word got around that this was not the actual Fleetwood Mac, audiences became hostile. The band started to get turned away from several gigs, with the next several pulled by promoters before they could even show up. To their credit, Legs, aka The New Fleetwood Mac, continued and suffered through additional heckling before things finally started to turn rather violent. People hucking bottles, charging the stage, and members just started to quit. The tour fell apart, and the real Fleetwood Mac sued Davis for his use of the band's name. That lawsuit would take another 4 years of court battles before finally being settled out of court for what I suspect was millions of dollars, because, as it turns out, the members of Fleetwood Mac had in fact signed over the naming rights. They didn't own the name Fleetwood Mac, so they probably paid Davis a shit ton of money. The band decided to leave England for a fresh start in California in late 1973, and it would turn out to be the most important decision the band had ever made. More on that in a bit, though. In order to understand this full story, I now need to take you guys back to the 60s again, where we're going to meet a young Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks. Buckingham and Nicks first sang together at a church event performing a cover of California Dreamin' by the Mamas and the Papas. He was in a psychedelic rock band called Fritz and asked her to join it as the lead singer. At this point, they both had a shared interest in music, but nothing romantic seemed on the horizon. Fritz opened for major acts like Janis Joplin, CCR, Santana, and were starting to gain significant attention. So much so that in late 1971, Keith Olsen, intrigued by Lindsey and Stevie's talents, invited them to Los Angeles to work on their music as a duo. In 1972, they disbanded the band Fritz, began dating, and moved to Los Angeles to start recording demos immediately. Despite financial struggles, with Nicks taking on multiple jobs to support them, they managed to remain committed to their music and barely each other. By 1973, they had refined their material and recorded their very first album, appropriately titled Buckingham Nicks. Despite achieving their goals and actually recording an album together, the relationship was already beginning to struggle. Lindsey was controlling, and the two would have heated arguments because Nicks stuck up for herself. Even the photo shoot for the album cover of their album album Buckingham Nicks was controversial. When the photographer asked Nicks to take her shirt off, she said no. Buckingham freaked out. He declared this high art and that she should not be so stuck up and be willing to go in the moment. Nicks relented, and if you look at the cover of Buckingham Nicks, you will see a shirtless Stevie Nicks. Released in September of 1973, the album featured a blend of folk rock with a primal energy and hinted at greater potential. However, despite showing promise, the album failed commercially, receiving very minimal promotion and even worse reviews. Polydor Records dropped the duo soon after this, and they were back to square one. Despite that setback, Buckingham and Nicks continued to write new material and tour throughout the LA area. In December 1974, a desperate Mick Fleetwood heard one of those demos and was intrigued. He went to see Buckingham Nicks perform at a downtown show and was very impressed with what he heard. He immediately approached Buckingham to join Fleetwood Mac, but there was a problem. He and Nicks were a package deal. It wasn't really what Mick had in mind, but Mick was also a pretty easygoing dude, so he said, hey, why not? After several meetings getting to know the duo, the band held a vote over dinner. Christine McVie had the final vote. Luckily, she and Nicks had quickly developed a rapport, and the new Fleetwood Mac was born. With Buckingham and Nicks on board, Fleetwood Mac underwent a complete metamorphosis. They transformed what last vestiges of a blues band remained into a soft rock powerhouse. Between 1974 and 1979, the band would release 3 landmark albums. The self-titled, yes, I know they already released the self-titled, but the new self-titled album, Fleetwood Mac, Rumors, and Tusk. But it would all come at the cost of friendships, marriages, personal health, and at times, even their own safety. Unbeknownst to their new bandmates, Nicks and Buckingham were bringing with them a lot of baggage. They were already at each other's throats fairly regularly, and Lindsay's drinking was becoming a problem. Later, Nicks would even comment that they almost certainly would have broken up had they not joined Fleetwood Mac, but recognizing this was their big break they'd been working for, they decided to stick it out and see if things got better. Things did not get better. High on the energy of new members and no shortage of new songs, the recording sessions for their next album and first with Buckingham and Nicks went fairly well. There was what I would call a reasonable amount of cocaine use, at least for this group, and you'll understand what I mean in a bit because it will get very unreasonable soon. There was arguing and brief blow-ups now and then, but they were mostly between the two couples in the band and largely didn't impact the recording of the album. However, Buckingham and McVie did have a few blow-ups when Buckingham would share his suggestions, valid as they might have been, for how McVie should play his bass. McVie was eager to point out that the band's name was Fleetwood Mac, and you're telling Mac how to play. Their self-titled album, released in 1975, was a defining moment for the band. The album had 3 top 20 singles, including Rhiannon, Over My Head, and Say You Love Me. You know what's not on that list that is definitely on that album? Landslide. Landslide is on this album, and it didn't even crack the top 20. That's how good this album is. Now, that single would eventually go on to sell 2 million copies when a live version was released in 1998, but still, that just tells you how popular those other songs were. The album was a slow burn, though, that grew in popularity as the band toured the United States, gaining a new fan base. And it worked. 57 weeks after the release of their self-titled album, Fleetwood Mac hit number 1 on the Billboard 200, which is a feat that just doesn't happen anymore. You don't see that slow climb like you used to. The success of the album set high expectations for their next release, and while the band would rise to the occasion, it came at a very high cost. You see, the next album would appropriately be called Rumors, referring to all the speculation about affairs and drug use by the press, and all the rumors and infighting that would define this era of the band. It was tongue-in-cheek, but it was also incredibly spot-on and maybe even mildly tasteless, but accurate. Recording began in February of 1976, and almost immediately it was clear there were going to be issues. Buckingham and Nicks' 8-year on-again, off-again relationship was in its final death throes and forcing the rest of the band to suffer their arguments and eventual screaming matches. And if one breakup in the band wasn't enough disruption, Christine and John McVie's marriage was also unraveling, strained by John's excessive drinking and Christine's affair with a member of the band's lighting crew, whom they did not fire, and who she would flirt with openly in front of John. Even Mick Fleetwood was somber and hiding in a cocaine-fueled haze, still not over his divorce from wife Jenny Boyd more than 2 years earlier. Despite the album's creation being marked by intense personal turmoil, it couldn't have been better for the band. The songs they were writing were painful, personal, and in many cases, incredibly antagonistic towards their other bandmates. Buckingham's Go Your Own Way and Nicks's Dreams offered dueling perspectives on their own breakup, with each song a cathartic release of pent-up emotion. Lindsay's anger with Nix fueled his lyricism for that song, getting revenge by literally forcing his ex-girlfriend to sing pointed insults at herself, effectively attacking herself with lyrics like "packin' up, shackin' up's all you wanna do." Conversely, Stevie's own version of their breakup anthem, Dreams, would turn out to be Fleetwood Mac's most streamed song on Spotify to date. Dreams was essentially saying through Stevie's lyricism, though in a slightly more polite way, that she placed the blame for their breakup at both of their feet and wasn't nearly as childish about the whole thing as Lindsay was being. McVie, coping with her separation from John, channeled her feelings into songs like You Make Lovin' Fun, focusing on new love inspired by that band's lighting director, Curry Grant. John McVie found it rather difficult to see Christine move on, creating a beyond uncomfortable atmosphere during recording sessions. So much so that Christine and eventually Nix were banned from bringing men they were dating to their recording sessions. When asked why John was still allowed to bring women to their sessions if Christine couldn't, literally in front of the woman he had brought that day, he turned to Christine and said, "Because she doesn't mean anything to me." End quote. The woman in question then got up, hurling something at John and storming out of the room. The second most famous song on Rumors, The Chain, has a particularly strange story behind it. It is the only song on Rumors that was credited to all 5 band members. The song was created out of bits and riffs contributed by all the band members, while the lyrics were written entirely by Nix. The Chain tells the story of the deteriorating relationship of the entire band rather than just the individual members. The song describes an invisible chain holding up a group of people together, and when time has run its course, and it is time to sever the chain for everyone's well-being, the painful memories and strong emotions manage to keep it together. A perfect metaphor for Fleetwood Mac, written by the band itself. Now, with all this upheaval, you might be wondering, how did they manage to power through and keep this band together? And the answer is pretty simple. It's everybody's 2 favorite things: cocaine and money. Cocaine, because that's how they stayed up at night continuing to write constantly and fuel their truly maddening arguments. And money, because holy hell, they had done really well with that self-titled album, and they knew they were onto something. When asked just how much cocaine they did during recording of Rumors, the band often measured it not in weight, but rather in miles. As in, I must have snorted 7 miles of cocaine for that record. I choose that number because Mick Fleetwood has said on multiple occasions, over the course of the 70s, I snorted no less than 7 miles of cocaine. They did so much cocaine that the band had planned to thank their dealer in the liner notes for Rumors. That idea became a lot less funny when that dealer was murdered in a drug deal gone bad shortly before the release of the album. Had this group not been working on what would become one of the most popular albums of all time and constantly gacked out of their minds on cocaine, there is no way this album would ever have been released, and they certainly wouldn't have stayed together. You had 2 couples constantly fighting, one breaking up, one broken up, and everyone doing enough drugs to kill a horse. But Rumors was their magnum opus, often hailed as one of the top 10 albums of all time, and with good reason. It is a masterpiece. Upon its release in 1977, it did not take long for audiences to begin to speculate about the drama within the band and what the lyrics might be referring to. The band decided to ratchet up the speculation and Rumors even more with a now infamous photo on the cover of Rolling Stone. The photo depicts all 5 band members lying in bed together. At the time of the shoot, Christine and John were in the midst of their divorce, while Lindsay and Stevie had finally called it quits for good. On the cover, Nix and Fleetwood Mac are actually cuddled together in the middle of the bed. Christine and Lindsay were cuddled up on the right side, and Christine, not wanting to be anywhere near John in light of the recent divorce proceedings, put John on the other side of the bed, casually reading a Playboy, which, in my opinion, is not the same thing. Everybody gets coupled up, and John, you're with a Playboy. Not fair. Anyway, the shoot did exactly what it was meant to. It was a perfect marketing tool. The band had laid their personal lives out on the album for everyone to see, and this was their invitation to speculate. The album was beyond successful. Rumors sold 40 million copies worldwide, making it the 6th best-selling album of the 70s and the 12th best-selling album of all time. Let me say that one more time. Rumors sold 40 million copies worldwide. With that success came an incredibly extensive tour, which of course further strained the band's fragile relationships. On stage, Nix emerged as the star, captivating audiences, while Buckingham and McVie struggled with feelings of betrayal and loss, making the entire tour emotionally taxing. While Buckingham and Nix would bicker and even scream at each other from time to time, by the time the tour rolled around, John and Christine had completely stopped talking, really only acknowledging each other when they took the stage, and even then, just barely. The tension was palpable, with older old wounds resurfacing and new, if not predictable, conflicts arising. The largest of which occurred when it was discovered that Nix and Mick Fleetwood were actually having an affair. It had begun around the Australian leg of the Rumours tour and nearly broke the band in two. Even Fleetwood's estranged, or possibly at this point ex-wife Jenny Boyd, confronted Nix about the affair, exposing the betrayal to literally everybody. Fleetwood and Nix later attributed the affair to a combination of cocaine and pent-up sexual tension, but by my count, anybody with eyes and common sense could have told you this was coming. Fleetwood, in his words, described it as a, quote, classic intergalactic mess, while Nix acknowledged it was a mistake and caused a lot of pain for everyone involved. But they were young and about 71% cocaine at that point, so their decision-making was iffy at best. After a short break, it was back to the studio. Things were as bad or worse than they were during the Rumours recording sessions. If cocaine was measured in miles for Rumours, the recording sessions for their new album, Tusk, would be measured simply by calling it a, quote, cocaine blizzard. That's an amount that's literally too much to quantify. A blizzard is everywhere. That is how they described their drug use. Curiously, and I'm not entirely sure why, one of the early decisions made by the band at the start of the Tusk recording sessions was that this was to be a double album. Why? Remains unclear. But Mick Fleetwood demanded it, and they were all in the middle of that cocaine blizzard, so why not? But I'll tell you why not. Because by this point, Nix and Buckingham are completely broken up and have been forced to tour and sing each other's songs, taunting each other for the better part of a year. And by now, John and Christine McVie's divorce is final, and they don't speak. And for good measure, Mick and Stevie had also had a fling, but luckily that came to an end rather quickly when Fleetwood admitted to sleeping with Nix's best friend, Sarah Recor, whose husband worked for the band's touring crew. And allegedly Mick was also trying to get back with his wife, Jenny Boyd, leaving Mick cheating on Nix with Sarah, and then cheating on Jenny with Nix, and thinking that it was going to work out to where he either got back with his wife or Nix. The whole thing was an incestuous, curb your enthusiasm level of uncomfortable mess. With all this stacked against them, you would think Fleetwood Mac would do whatever was possible to reduce obstacles or difficulty in the recording process. Unfortunately, Lindsey Buckingham had a very different idea. Anyone in that band who thought that they were going to build on the sound created on Rumours was quickly disabused of that idea. Buckingham insisted that the new album be more experimental and not just be a Rumours 2. Influenced by bands like the Talking Heads, he took experimentation to new heights that would even irritate George Martin. He was equal parts meticulous and irrational. He would tape microphones to the floor and begin doing sing push-ups over them in order to, quote, try new things. If anyone was curious if Lindsey was going through a hard time, they needn't wonder about halfway through the Tusk recording sessions. One day, while showering at the studio, I know I had no idea they had showers, but apparently they do, Lindsey just freaks out and cuts all his hair off with a pair of tiny scissors. After that, his whole manner of dress and behavior slowly started to change. He was wearing eyeliner and really starting to live in that post-punk look. But you got to keep in mind, he was doing a great deal of cocaine and was channeling his inner Brian Wilson. Even going so far as to allegedly borrow the unreleased Smile Masters for inspiration. It's probably bullshit, but I've also heard both Smile and this album, so it's not impossible. There are songs that sound quite similar. In addition to all of this, despite having a custom studio built for the express purpose of recording this album, many of the songs were recorded at Buckingham's home studio. Not only that, on multiple songs, Buckingham plays all the instruments himself, breaking the deal he had made with his bandmates to be sure to include them at some point for each song. They even had to have duplicates of all recordings just in case Lindsey came into the studio in the middle of the day when the rest of the band was sleeping off the previous night's activities and just began recording alone and taping over whatever work they had done that night. When they were together, screaming matches between Lindsey and Stevie were frequent and bordered on physical brawls. There's even one alleged incident of shoving Stevie over the hood of a car, but the details are murky and I really don't want to get sued by a very old Lindsey Buckingham, so let's just say allegedly. Back in the studio, Buckingham's experimentation was pissing everybody off, especially Nix, who felt like she'd been completely sidelined during the entire creative process. No one but Lindsey wanted this big, complicated recording process, but they went along with it. And the reason they acquiesced was because Lindsey had begun to talk at this point about really wanting to start that solo career, and no one wanted to lose an integral part of the band, so they gave him a wide berth and put up with whatever stupid bullshit he wanted to do in the studio. When he would spend 2 hours taping microphones to fan blades, they'd just hang out in the corner and do cocaine until he said go. In the end, the album took 10 months, they recorded 20 songs, and it was the most expensive album at the time, coming in at over $1 million to record. Tusk was released on October 12, 1979. And if you're wondering, Garrett, why did he call it Tusk? Apparently, that's what Mick Fleetwood calls his penis. He had adorned the entire recording studio with various tusks, also allegedly to throw them in the face of Nick's after she dumped him following that whole best friend banging fiasco. Musically, the album is interesting at times, even entertaining, but I will say it seriously lacks cohesion. Now, I've seen this album compared to the Beatles' White Album multiple times, saying, the White Album is more experimental, no two songs really fit together, but that's not true in my opinion. I've listened to both of these albums several times now, and I just get the feeling that Tusk is a lot less ready for release. And full disclosure, I'm completely biased. I love the Beatles, and I'm a so-so Fleetwood Mac fan. But if you look at the two objectively, yes, they're both disparate songs of weird experimentation, but for my money, the White Album feels like a completed album, and Tusk just doesn't. After release of the album, the critics were torn. Many praised the production and the experimentation, but none of them were nearly as impressed as they had been with what was released with Rumors. Despite all this, though, the album would go on to sell over 4 million copies, and if that sounds like a lot, this next sentence is going to blow your mind. After they sold those 4 million copies, Warner Brothers considered the album to be a complete failure, one that they placed squarely at the feet of Lindsey Buckingham and his stupid, expensive experiments. Now, could it have just been a quality thing? Maybe. But the other problem was, you gotta remember this is a double album, which cost $16 at the time, which I know, what's the big deal, right? Well, I did a little bit of math. That's $69 in 2024 money. I sure as shit wouldn't pay you $69 for a copy of Tusk, and I'm betting a lot of other people made the same decision. Or it could have just been the fact that it was a needlessly complicated record and that was seemingly different just to say it was different, rather than doing what they were good at and basically making Rumors 2.0. It didn't really matter in the end though. This was the zenith of Fleetwood Mac. Despite the record label's disappointment with Tusk, it was still a quadruple platinum album that spawned 6 very unlikely singles. As was the style at the time, the band set out on a debaucherous 11-month tour recording tracks for a live album that would be released the following year. The band's 13th studio album, Mirage, was released in 1982, following a 1981 run that included solo albums by Nicks, Fleetwood, and Buckingham. The recording process was much more conventional and a lot less expensive, although the amount of drugs and shouting that were involved were somehow more than the previous album. The drug use was so bad that years later, Nicks would actually have to have her septum repaired from excessive cocaine use. So if anybody thinks this all sounds super awesome, it isn't. They did too many drugs. Mirage spent 5 weeks at number 1, and the band went on a short 18-city tour through North America. Following the tour, the band went on hiatus, leaving many to believe that they had seen the last of Fleetwood Mac. Over that time, McVie, Nicks, and Buckingham found solo success and suffered hardships. Inexplicably, Mick Fleetwood had to file for bankruptcy. I know, right? Where the fuck did his money go? Nicks checked herself into the Betty Ford Clinic, and John McVie had an addiction-related series of seizures. Not entirely sure what that last part means. I suspect it was DTs from alcoholism, but your guess is as good as mine. Somehow the original lineup wasn't beat yet. They had one more album in them, and they were ready to hit the studio. Tango in the Night was released in April of 1987, but only barely. The recording process was tedious, even for Fleetwood Mac. Somehow Mick Fleetwood's cocaine use had spiraled to new heights, and he would get so out of control that Lindsey Buckingham had to set up a Winnebago in his own driveway so that Mick could go retire there with his friends when things became too disruptive in the studio. The whole album took 18 months to record, and in that time, Stevie Nicks made an appearance no more than 2 weeks to record her parts. And when she was there, she was typically quite drunk, and Buckingham found her vocals to be completely unusable. In fact, he would go so far as to employ early sampling tricks to put Stevie onto songs that she hadn't actually sang on, saying things that she hadn't actually said. Somehow, despite all this, the album still managed to sell a whopping 3 million copies, and was largely viewed as a step in the right direction, recapturing some of that original Fleetwood Mac Rumors sound. Not original Fleetwood Mac, mind you, and not the new Fleetwood Mac, but that Lindsey Buckingham, Stevie Nicks Fleetwood Mac, before they went and made Tusk. Anyway, after the release of the album, the band met at Christine's house to plan the tour, and it was then that Lindsey Buckingham announced that he was leaving the band. Nicks began screaming and physically attacked him. Somehow that did not convince him to stick around, and the next day, Lindsey formally left the band. He was replaced by 2 new guitarists, and the Mac continued. In 1990, Fleetwood Mac released their 15th studio album, Behind the Mask. It was only certified gold and was considered a low point for the band. They had taken on a more adult contemporary sound sound that no one was into. Following the tour, Nix announced in 1991 she too was done. Allegedly, the impetus was the fact that she wanted to use an unreleased song on one of her greatest hits albums, but Mick Fleetwood refused to allow her to do so that he could include it on a Fleetwood Mac Rarities album of his own. So she just said, you know what? Fuck you, Mick. Can't have my song, you can't have me. I quit. I'm paraphrasing, but I suspect it was something like that. The band briefly reunited in 1993 for Bill Clinton's inauguration, a moment that now feels so incredibly strange that it's weird to even say. 2 years later, in 1995, the remaining members and a cast of new musicians released Fleetwood Mac's 16th album, Time, and it was a failure. So much so that Christine left the band and several of the replacement players also called it quits. In 1997, the band reunited with the original members, the original members as of 1975, to record a concert film and soundtrack called The Dance. It was a massive success, basically a greatest hits of Rumors, Tusk, and their second self-titled album. Both the video and audio recording sold millions of copies. It was a massive success and kept the band touring for much of 1997. A decade went by, and eventually the band reunited without Christine and went back on tour in 2013 and 2014, largely avoiding each other and seeing each other only on stage when they absolutely had to, and typically Lindsay and Nix would glare at each other as they sang the insulting songs they had written about one another some 30 years previous. In January of 2018, Fleetwood Mac received the Music Hair's Person of the Year award and reunited to perform 5 songs at the Grammy-hosted party honoring them. After Lindsay spoke to an audience that included former President Clinton, it was Nix's turn at the microphone while the rest of the band stood behind her. As Nix went on at length, Christine pretended to check her watch before breaking into a small waltz with Mick Fleetwood. All of this commenting on the fact that Stevie was going on and on and on. Buckingham could also be seen behind her smirking and whispering to McVie as Stevie continued to talk. When her speech concluded, everyone applauded and the band left arm in arm before returning later to perform a 5-song set. It was a lovely reunion, or so everyone thought. 2 nights later, Lindsey Buckingham was sitting on the couch watching the Grammys when he got a call from his manager, Irving Azoff. The message was confusing and dire. He said, quote, "Stevie never wants to be on stage with you again," end quote. Lindsey was caught so off guard, he legitimately asked, "What did I do?" After 40 years of being absolutely terrible to each other, what had happened in the last 2 days that Stevie didn't even want to see him again? According to Azoff, Stevie was angry that Buckingham had made a derisive comment about Rhiannon being played when the band took the stage a few nights previously. Allegedly, Lindsey claims that it wasn't that it was a Stevie song that made him angry, he just felt that it didn't accurately portray the full oeuvre of the band. If anybody had forgotten, you need to remember, Lindsey Buckingham is sort of a narcissistic prick, and he constantly would hit the whole band, specifically Stevie, with shitty comments like this. Like, oh, why are they playing Rhiannon? That's not really a Fleetwood Mac song, it's more of a Stevie Nicks song. But the comment wasn't the only issue at hand. It turns out the final nail in the coffin was a smirk that Buckingham gave from the stage while Nicks was giving her speech. She found it deeply disrespectful and would not abide being around Lindsey Buckingham any longer. Now, in Lindsey's defense, Christine and Mick were literally waltzing behind Stevie, so a smirk seems pretty innocent. And literally every person in that building thought that Nicks was going on entirely too long. However, of all the people in the building that night, there was only one person that had made decades of Stevie Nicks' life unpleasant, and she'd had enough. When the call ended, Lindsey had drawn all the wrong conclusions. He just assumes Stevie was saying that she had had enough and she was quitting the band, and that is not what she meant. When Lindsey fired off an email to Mick Fleetwood to assure him that the band would be just fine without Stevie Nicks, there was no reply. Sensing something was up, Buckingham gave Irving Azoff another call and asked a very pointed question. Is Stevie leaving the band, or am I getting kicked out? Azoff, incredibly uncomfortable, took a beat before breaking it to the guitarist that he was being pushed out of the band. Buckingham had found himself on the wrong end of an ultimatum. Nicks had told the rest of her bandmates, either he goes or I go. The band, not surprisingly, chose Nicks, and Lindsey was out for good. Lindsey, for his part, did not take it well. Within weeks, lawsuits were in the works. Not looking to rehash everyone's dirty laundry in a courtroom, the band agreed to a multi-million-dollar settlement to cover the loss of tour revenue. While Stevie had claimed that the last straw saw was the alleged smirk from the stage while she was accepting an award, I also read that the two had been feuding leading up to the award show. You see, Fleetwood Mac was planning to go back on tour, and the dates were all set when suddenly out of nowhere, Lindsay announced that he wants to do a quick solo tour without the rest of the band, and then they can start touring. This was not okay with Stevie. Stevie felt everyone had already agreed to the dates, and Lindsay was pulling some power move bullshit in order to get everybody to readjust their schedule to accommodate him, and she wasn't going to have it. And if it wasn't any of that, it could have just been the breaking point of two people that had hated each other for over 30 years after sort of loving each other for about 8. That September, Fleetwood Mac went on tour with Lindsay replaced by 2 guitarists. On July 25th, 2020, founding member Peter Green died at the age of 73. Imagine how weird it must have been for that guy to watch his own band become so incredibly famous without him. I often wonder if he ever got any sort of residuals from those albums knowing that he created the band. I don't think so. Since the dismissal of Buckingham, the band had been plagued with questions about whether the original lineup would ever play together again. And while I would have said the odds were very slim to begin with, on November 30th, 2022, that hope ended when Christine McVie died at the age of 79. And it's very safe to say that Fleetwood Mac most likely died with her. But they had a damn good run, especially when you consider just how dysfunctional this band was and for so very, very long. Despite the fights, the broken hearts, the betrayal, the record-breaking drug use, the alleged violence, and even breaking up a few times, Fleetwood Mac continues to have a major cultural impact on new generations. Hell, Rumors even re-entered the Billboard Top 10 in 2020 when a dude on a skateboard turned the song Dreams into a meme. No matter how many times or how many different ways life tries to kill Fleetwood Mac, it just won't go away and continue to influence young new musicians every year, despite pretty much hating each other the entire time they existed as a successful band and not producing anything worth listening to in the last 40 years. It's actually pretty damn amazing. And even if you don't love their music, you have to respect the amount of drugs and sheer willpower it must have taken to not murder each other and create what is often considered some of the greatest albums of all time. Okay, folks, that's going to do it. I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, slightly different than usual. Came in roughly at about the same length, I think. It's a weird story, especially that part where suddenly there was a new Fleetwood Mac. That part made me laugh quite hard. And cocaine blizzard is definitely a term that should be used. That is very funny. As always, rate, review, subscribe. We'll be back with the normal format next week. If you made it this far, I'm going to give you a hint. I'm pretty sure we're talking about Mariah Carey. I know. A lot of people are going to be pissed. Anyway, that's going to do it for this week. hatePodMail@gmail.com. We got Discord servers, we got subreddits. There's easy ways to find us. Just reach out. For Why I Hate This Album, I have been one of your hosts, Garrett Harvey, and I have not been one of your hosts, Timothy Richardson.
There's cowboys running through my dreams. Nothing's quite the way it seems. I joined the Navy, got kicked out in a week. My facial features aren't distinct. Try to find some meaning in these songs. The genius is a genius, got it wrong. No, it's a lobster murder sex thing. It's the bleaching of the rear. A full assault on both your ears. The riffs are too repetitive. The lyrics make no sense. All the songs are B-sides. The cover art's a mess. Listen to it for a week. Now that week has passed. It's the Why I Hate This Album podcast with Tim and Garrett.